November 14, 1977. Group of Soviet forces H-Courier, WÜNSDORF, East Germany. The smell of Mahorka tobacco and ozone, the hum of teletype machines. The map table was vast, a sprawling topographic ocean of the Fulda Gap, covered in red acetate markers representing the greatest concentration of armor in human history. In the dim, smoke-choked light of the command bunker, the Soviet strategists were not afraid. They were doing math, and the math said they were winning. To the Soviet High Command, the equation of modern warfare was solved. Speed equaled survival. Altitude equaled safety. They had built the MiG-25 Foxbat to outrun missiles at the edge of space. They had built the T-72 to swarm the plains of Europe like a tidal wave of steel. Their doctrine was absolute. Faster, higher, more. Then, the intelligence reports on the new American tank killer arrived on the heavy oak table. The photos were grainy, stolen from flight tests at Edwards Air Force Base. They showed an aircraft that violated every rule of the jet age. It was ugly. It was slow. It was silent. General Viktor Kulikov picked up the photograph and laughed. The room followed suit. The aircraft in the picture, the Fairchild Republic A-10, looked like a mistake. It had straight wings like a relic from World War II. It had engines mounted awkwardly high on the tail, exposed and vulnerable. It had a nose that looked like it had been punched flat. But the most damning statistic was the speed. Subsonic? In the atomic age? The Americans have built a crop duster to stop the Red Army. My ZSU gunners will think it is a holiday. They will not even need radar. They will shoot it down with binoculars. The Soviet confidence was rooted in a specific flaw of logic, the Doppler trap. Their entire air defense network, the ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, the SA-6 Gainfuls, was calibrated to track high-speed, high-heat targets. Their radar computers prioritized objects moving at Mach 1 or higher. To the electronic eyes of the Soviet Union, a slow-moving, cold-engine aircraft hugging the tree line wasn't a threat. It was background noise. It was a glitch. The generals saw a sitting duck. They saw an aircraft that couldn't outrun a 1950s MiG, let alone a modern surface-to-air missile. They theorized that the A-10 would have a battlefield life expectancy of less than 7 minutes. They believed the Americans had wasted millions on a flying coffin that would be swatted from the sky before it could fire a single shot. They looked at the photos, but they didn't look deep enough. They saw the engines, but they didn't see the placement masked the heat signature from the ground. They saw the slow speed, but they didn't see the tight turn radius that allowed it to linger in the kill box. And most importantly, they saw the cockpit glass, but they didn't see what was underneath the pilot's seat. They did not see the titanium bathtub. The laughter in WÜNSDORF continued late into the night. They toasted to the stupidity of American engineering. They toasted to the easy kill. They had no idea that the crop duster was not built to fly. It was built to bleed, and it was bringing a gun the size of a Volkswagen to the party. The Phantom had arrived. And it was hungry. January 29, 1991. Al-Wafra oil fields, Kuwaiti-Saudi border. The taste of burning crude. Zero visibility. The battle was not supposed to happen this way. The Iraqi Republican Guard, trained by Soviet advisors and equipped with the pride of the Moscow arsenal, the T-72 Euro main battle tank, sat waiting in the gloom. They were the inheritors of the Red Steamroller doctrine. They believed in armor thickness, muzzle velocity, and the sheer, crushing weight of numbers. Inside the lead T-72, the commander felt the vibration of the 780-horsepower diesel engine. It was a comforting rumble. He checked his perimeter. Flanking him were the ZSU-23-4 Shilkas, self-propelled anti-aircraft guns with 4 liquid-cooled barrels and a radar dish that spun maniacally, searching the sky. The The Shilka was the magician of the Soviet air defense network. It had terrified NATO pilots for 2 decades. Its RPK-2 Tobol radar computer was designed to lock onto the heat and speed of a supersonic jet and shred it with 4,000 rounds per minute. The commander looked at the radar screen inside the ZSU via the comms link. It was clear. The sky was empty. No F-15 Eagles screaming at Mach 2. No F-16 Falcons diving from the stratosphere. According to the Soviet manual, if the radar was clear, the tank was safe. The logic was binary. If they cannot see you, they cannot kill you. But the Soviet manual was written for a war of altitudes. It did not account for a war of the gutter. The attack did not begin with a warning. It began with disintegration. There was no screech of a falling bomb. There was no smoke trail of a missile. 1 second, the T-72 to the commander's right was a functioning war machine. The next second, it was a volcano. The turret, weighing 12 tons, was severed from the chassis and thrown 30 feet into the air. The ammunition carousel inside the hull detonated, sending a column of white fire 500 feet into the night. This was the jack-in-the-box effect, a catastrophic failure mode the Soviet engineers claimed they had fixed. They hadn't. Panic surged through the radio network. "Missile! Missile!" screamed the flank guard. But it wasn't a missile. Missiles leave a trail. Missiles have a flight time you can track. This was instantaneous. The horror of the A-10's primary weapon, the GAU-8 Avenger, lies in the physics of sound versus velocity. The 30mm rounds leave the barrel traveling at 3,500 feet per second. The speed of sound is only 1,100 feet per second. This creates a temporal anomaly on the receiving end. The target is struck, penetrated, and destroyed before the sound of the gun firing actually arrives. The soldiers die in total silence. The roar of the gun is the requiem they never hear. The ground erupted. Sand turned to glass. Then the sound arrived. It was not the high-pitched whine of a jet engine. It was a low, guttural, tearing noise, like a titan ripping a sheet of canvas in half. BRRRT. The noise vibrated in the teeth of the survivors. It was the sound of the GAU-8 firing 70 rounds a second. The Iraqi gunners swung their ZSU turrets frantically, searching the sky for the attacker. They looked up at 10,000 feet. They looked up at 5,000 feet. They couldn't find it, because the ghost was flying at 50 feet. The A-10 Warthog was hugging the desert floor, flying in the clutter. To the Soviet-designed radar systems, the A-10 moved too slowly to be an aircraft. The Doppler filters, designed to ignore trucks and shifting sand dunes, filtered the A-10 out as background noise. The massive, straight wings generated so much lift that the pilot could loiter just above the tank turrets, turning tight circles that a supersonic fighter would stall attempting. "We are engaging shadows. The radar will not lock. It will not lock." The ZSU-23-4 gunner switched to optical tracking, peering through his sights. He finally saw it. A dark, cruciform shape banking hard against the smoke of the burning oil wells. It looked clumsy. It looked slow. He depressed the trigger, sending a stream of 23mm high-explosive shells toward the beast. He hit it. Sparks flew from the A-10's right wing. The Soviet doctrine stated that a 23mm hit was lethal to any Western aircraft. A hit meant a severed hydraulic line, a fire, an ejection. The gunner waited for the explosion. He waited for the parachute. The plane did not explode. It turned. The A-10 absorbed the fire like a boxer taking a jab. The pilot didn't eject. He simply adjusted his trim tabs. The aircraft banked around, bringing the nose and the 7-barrel Gatling gun to bear on the ZSU. The Shilka was a predator of the air, but on the ground it was thin-skinned. It had only 9 millimeters of armor. It was designed to fight airplanes, not flying tanks. The A-10 pilot squeezed the trigger for a 2-second burst. 140 rounds of depleted uranium left the Avenger. The kinetic energy of a single round is sufficient to disable a light armored vehicle. The cumulative energy of a 2-second burst is equivalent to a locomotive hitting a brick wall at 100 miles per hour. The ZSU didn't just explode, it was erased from the battlefield physics model. The kinetic impact vaporized the crew instantly, turning the magician into a smear of burning aluminum. Silence returned to the desert. The surviving tank crews buttoned their hatches, locking themselves inside their steel coffins. They believed they were safer inside than outside. This was the fatal error of the Soviet worldview. They trusted the armor. They trusted the thickness of the cast steel turret. They believed that no gun could penetrate the frontal arc of a T-72. They were applying World War II logic to a depleted uranium problem. Above them, the Phantom circled again. The pilot wasn't rushing. He wasn't afraid of their guns anymore. He checked his fuel state. He checked his ammo counter. He had plenty of both. The Soviet system of mass over complexity was collapsing in real time. The laugh from the bunker in East Germany had traveled thousands of miles to die in the sand of Kuwait. The sitting duck was systematically executing the apex predators, and the worst part for the men inside the tanks was the waiting, listening for the tearing sound, knowing that when they heard it, they were already dead. Circa 1973, Eglin Air Force Base Armament Development Lab, Florida. Sterile fluorescence, the hum of supercomputers. The heavy smell of machining oil. While the Soviet generals were drinking vodka in East Germany, laughing at the silhouette of the A-10, a different kind of war was being fought in the fluorescent-lit basements of the American military-industrial complex. This war was not fought with tanks. It was fought with slide rules, spectrometers, and a deep, terrifying understanding of metallurgy. The U.S. engineers at Fairchild Republic and General Electric faced a crisis. Intelligence reports from the Yom Kippur War had confirmed a disturbing reality. The age of the shaped charge was ending. For decades, anti-tank warfare relied on high-explosive anti-tank, or HEAT, rounds. These worked on chemical energy, an explosion that focused a jet of superplastic copper to burn through steel. But the Soviets were smart. They had developed composite armor and explosive reactive armor, ERA. ERA was essentially tiles of explosives bolt on to the tank. When a U.S. missile hit the tile exploded outward, disrupting the copper jet and leaving the tank unscathed. The T-72 was becoming immune to chemical energy. The math of explosions had hit a wall. To kill the new Soviet giants, the Americans had to abandon chemistry and return to the oldest law of physics in the universe. If you cannot burn through the door, you must kick it down. They needed kinetic energy. They needed a solid dart, moving so fast and hitting so hard that no amount of reactive armor could stop it. The equation was simple. Ke equals 1/2 mv squared, mass times velocity squared. They had the velocity, a 30mm cannon. But they needed the mass. They needed a metal dense enough to punch through the glacis plate of a T-72, but cheap enough to fire 4,000 times a minute. They looked at tungsten. It was dense, hard, and effective, but it had a fatal flaw. When a tungsten rod hits armor at Mach 3, it mushrooms. The tip blunts upon impact, increasing surface area and reducing penetration. It was like trying to stab a tank with a hammer. Tungsten is a gentleman's metal. It asks for permission to enter. We need a thief. We need something that breaks the lock. The solution came from the nuclear waste dumps of the Cold War. For years, the U.S. had been enriching uranium for bombs and reactors, stripping out the volatile U-235 isotope. What was left behind was U-238. Depleted uranium. It was considered garbage. It was heavy, mildly radioactive, and useless for power generation. But when the ballistics engineers looked at it under the microscope, they realized they were staring at the perfect killer. Depleted uranium possesses a unique, horrifying material property known as adiabatic shearing. Unlike tungsten, which mushrooms on impact, depleted uranium fractures. As the round strikes the armor, the edges shear off, keeping the tip perpetually sharp as it burrows through the steel. It effectively sharpens itself as it penetrates. Furthermore, U-238 is pyrophoric. The immense friction of penetration heats the dust to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Once the round punches through the armor and enters the crew compartment, the uranium dust spontaneously ignites. It is not just a bullet, it is a kinetic flamethrower. They turned nuclear waste into a spear. With the bullet designed, they needed the delivery system, and this is where the A-10 Warthog ceased to be an airplane. In every other aircraft design in history, the engineers built a plane and then found a place to attach a gun. For the A-10, the process was reversed. General Electric built the GAU-8 Avenger, a weapon so large it weighed as much as a Volkswagen Beetle and was roughly the size of a limousine, and told Fairchild Republic, "Build wings for this." The GAU-8 was not a machine gun. It was a hydraulic Gatling cannon system. It didn't use a belt, which could jam under G-force. It used a linkless feed system, a double-ended drum the size of a concrete mixer that cycled rounds through a helical drive. It was an endless loop of death, returning the spent casings back into the drum so the shift in weight wouldn't unbalance the aircraft. The gun was a monster, and it tried to kill the plane. During the initial test fires at Eglin, the engineers encountered a physics problem that nearly canceled the project. The recoil force of the GAU-8 was 10,000 pounds force. The two TF-34 jet engines on the A-10 produced 9,000 pounds of thrust each. This meant that when the pilot pulled the trigger, the recoil of the gun was actually stronger than one of the airplane's engines. If the pilot fired a long burst while flying slow, the gun would literally stop the plane in midair, causing it to stall and fall out of the sky. The vibration was seismic. It was so violent it shook the rivets out of the prototype wings. It rattled the instruments until the glass cracked. It created oxygen starvation in the cockpit as the gun gas was sucked into the engines, choking them out. When you fire the Avenger, the plane doesn't just vibrate. It screams. The HUD shudders. The stick kicks back. You feel the airframe groaning under the stress. You aren't flying anymore. You're riding a jackhammer. The wizards at Fairchild had to engineer around the gun's violence. They couldn't center the gun on the fuselage because the nose landing gear was in the way. If they moved the gun to the side, the recoil would spin the plane around every time it fired. So, they moved the plane. They offset the nose landing gear to the right, making the A-10 the only asymmetric aircraft in the U.S. inventory, just so the firing barrel, the one at the 9 o'clock position, was perfectly aligned with the aircraft's center of gravity. They built a fence on the nose to divert gun gas away from the engine intakes. They reinforced the airframe with honeycomb panels. But the true genius was not in the metal. It was in the math. The death dot appears on the HUD. The Soviet doctrine relied on the difficulty of the shot. Hitting a moving tank from a moving plane with a fixed gun is a calculus problem involving airspeed, wind drift, target velocity, bullet drop, and the Coriolis effect. In 1960, this was a guess. In the A-10, it was a certainty. The engineers integrated the Continuously Computed Impact Point, or CCIP. A digital ballistic computer took data from the radar altimeter, the inertial navigation system, and the air data computer. It calculated the exact trajectory of the heavy DU rounds in real time. The pilot didn't have to do the math. He didn't have to guess the drop. He just placed the death dot on the thermal image of the tank engine and held the trigger. The system accounted for the vibration. It accounted for the wind. It practically accounted for the rotation of the Earth. The dispersion of the GAU-8 is rated at 5 milliradians. This means that at 4,000 feet, 80% of the rounds will hit within a 20-foot circle. To a Soviet tank commander, this statistic is terrifying. It means the area of effect is exactly the size of a T-72. The A-10 doesn't spray bullets, it paints with them. It converts a grid coordinate into a scrap metal yard with surgical precision. While the Soviets were building millions of tons of steel armor, assuming the Americans would try to match them tank for tank, the U.S. engineers had sidestepped the contest entirely. They realized that the T-72 had a weakness. It was made of matter. And matter could be disassembled if you hit it with enough density. The arrogant Titan in the bunker thought he was fighting a plane. He didn't realize the plane was just a wrapper. He was fighting a flying physics equation designed to prove that 30 millimeters of depleted uranium is superior to 500 millimeters of cast steel. The lab work was done. The monster was awake. February 15, 1991, 30 miles north of Kuwait City. The sky is a black web of tracer fire. The cockpit is a cage of red warning lights. The Soviet doctrine of air defense was built on a simple premise: fragility. Aircraft are delicate. They are aluminum tubes filled with jet fuel and sensitive electronics. To kill an American fighter jet, you didn't need to destroy it completely. You just needed to break the chain of flight. A severed hydraulic line, a shattered turbine blade, or a cracked canopy was enough to force an ejection. The Iraqi commander of an SA-16 Gimlet man-portable air defense system watched from a dugout berm. He saw the dark shape of the Warthog banking low, hunting for trucks on the highway of death. This was his moment. The SA-16 was a nastier beast than the older Soviet missiles. It had a cooled infrared seeker designed to ignore flares. The commander waited until the A-10 turned its rear, exposing the heat of its engines. He fired. The missile screamed off the rail at Mach 2. It covered the distance in 3 seconds. It slammed into the starboard engine of the A-10. The explosion was massive. Shrapnel shredded the engine cowling, severed the hydraulic lines in the right wing, and peppered the fuselage with hundreds of steel fragments. In any other aircraft, an F-16, an F-18, a MiG-29, this was a catastrophic kill. The loss of an engine combined with the loss of hydraulics leads to an uncontrollable spin. The pilot ejects. The wreckage burns. The enemy celebrates. The Iraqi soldiers cheered. They saw the fireball. They saw the plane lurch violently to the right, dipping its wing toward the sand. But the plane did not fall. Inside the cockpit, Captain Paul Johnson, call sign PJ, didn't panic. He was busy wrestling a ghost. The master caution panel was lit up like a Christmas tree. Right engine fire. Hydraulic pressure system A, 0. Hydraulic pressure system B, 0. This was the nightmare scenario, the dual failure. The A-10 relies on 2 independent hydraulic systems to move its massive control surfaces. Without hydraulic pressure, the stick goes dead. The ailerons lock. The elevators freeze. In a normal plane, the pilot is now a passenger in a falling brick. But the engineers at Fairchild Republic had anticipated this moment 20 years ago. They knew the A-10 would be flying in the trash, the airspace where bullets are thicker than air. They knew it would get hit. So, they built a system that defied the evolution of aviation. Most modern aircraft are fly-by-wire. The pilot moves the stick, a computer interprets the motion, and sends an electrical signal to a hydraulic actuator. It is precise, but it is fragile. If the power goes or the fluid drains, the system dies. The A-10 has a manual reversion mode. It is the only frontline jet in the world that can be flown with cables and pulleys, like a B-17 bomber from 1943. When the hydraulics fail, the pilot pulls a lever. The stick disconnects from the hydraulic actuators and connects directly to steel cables running through the belly of the plane to trim tabs on the wings. The pilot is no longer moving the ailerons. He is moving the tabs on the edge of the ailerons, using aerodynamic pressure to force the control surfaces to move. It requires immense physical strength. It feels like driving a semi-truck with flat tires and no power steering, but it obeys the laws of physics, not the laws of hydrodynamics. The stick felt like it was set in concrete. I had to put both hands on it and brace my feet against the rudder pedals just to keep the wings level. It wasn't flying, it was a wrestling match with gravity. But the damn thing was still in the air. The Iraqi soldiers watched in stunned silence as the dead plane leveled out. Smoke poured from the destroyed engine, trailing black ribbons across the sky. The pilot shut down the fuel flow to the burning turbine, activated the fire extinguishers, and limped north. They fired their AK-47s. They fired 23mm anti-air guns. The rounds sparked off the belly of the aircraft. Ping, ping, thud. They were hitting it. They could see the impacts. But the plane ignored them. The titanium bathtub. The pilot was sitting inside 1,200 pounds of titanium armor. Technically called the Titanium Aircraft Tactical Armor, the pilots called it the bathtub. It was a seamless shell, ranging from 0.5 to 1.5 inches thick, enveloping the cockpit. It was designed to stop 23mm high-explosive rounds and 57mm fragments. While the F-16 pilot sat in a glass bubble, the A-10 pilot sat in a bank vault. The enemy rounds that penetrated the aluminum skin of the fuselage were stopped dead by the titanium liner. The glass canopy was bullet-resistant acrylic capable of stopping small arms fire. The Soviet laugh was now a grim realization. They had built weapons to kill systems. The Americans had built a system that refused to die. The zombie aircraft flew for 100 miles with one engine, no hydraulics, and half a tail missing. It landed at the forward operating base in Saudi Arabia, not with a graceful flare, but with a heavy thud, blowing out tires and skidding to a halt. The ground crews rushed out, foam trucks spraying the smoking engine. They looked at the airframe in horror. The right wing looked like Swiss cheese. The horizontal stabilizer was gone. The fuselage was riddled with holes you could put your fist through. By all aeronautical standards, this collection of metal should have been a smoking crater in the desert. It was ugly. It was broken. It was home. The pilot climbed out of the bathtub, sweaty and exhausted, but without a scratch. The next day, the maintenance crews cannibalized parts from another damaged bird. They patched the holes with sheet metal. They replaced the engine. And 24 hours later, that same aircraft, tail number 810964, was back over Kuwait. This was the psychological breaking point for the Iraqi army. In war, you accept that you will take losses. You accept that the enemy has bombs, but you cannot accept that the enemy is immortal. When you shoot a tank, it burns. When you shoot a man, he falls. But when you shoot the Warthog, it absorbs your hate, turns around, and erases you from existence. We hit it. I saw the explosion. It was dead. Why did it come back? Why won't it die? The Soviet generals in Moscow read the field reports with growing dread. Their entire philosophy of mass-produced attrition was failing. They assumed a 30% loss rate for NATO aircraft attacking their columns. They assumed the ZSU-23-4 would trade effectively. Instead, the exchange rate was mathematically impossible. The A-10s were flying thousands of sorties. They were taking hundreds of hits, and they were still flying. The fragile bird was a myth. The A-10 was a flying tank, designed by men who understood that in the mud and blood of the battlefield, high-tech sensors are nice, but titanium is better. The Soviets had prepared for a fencing match. The Americans had brought a sledgehammer. The redundancy extended even to the fuel. The A-10's tanks are lined with a reticulated foam mesh. When a bullet penetrates the tank, the foam suppresses the explosion by preventing the fuel vapor from igniting. Furthermore, the tanks are self-sealing. The chemical coating on the liner reacts with the leaking fuel to swell and plug the hole within seconds. The A-10 could fly with its main fuselage tanks severed, feeding off wing tanks, while the engine feed lines automatically isolated the leaks. It was a plumbing system designed by a paranoid plumber. The Ghost returns to the fight. Back on the highway, the Iraqi column was stalled. The wreckage of the lead vehicles blocked the path. Then they heard it again, the low, slow drone. The soldiers looked up, shielding their eyes against the sun. It wasn't a fresh plane. It was the one they had killed yesterday. The patch on the wing was visible. The soot from the fire was still on the tail. It wasn't just a machine anymore. It was a nemesis. The commander of the MANPADS unit dropped his launcher in the sand. There was no point. The physics were wrong. The logic was broken. The sitting duck was the hunter, and they were just the feed. February 28, 1991. Highway 80. The highway of death. The smell of roasted metal. The wind whistling through skeletons. The war ended not with a bang, but with a traffic jam of annihilation. On Highway 80, the retreat of the Iraqi army had turned into a gallery of horrors. Miles of twisted steel, burnt-out chassis, and abandoned loot. The T-72s, the BMPs, the ZSU-23-4s, the entire catalog of Soviet military exports lay in ruin. In the bunkers of WÜNSDORF and Moscow, the laughter had died weeks ago. The generals were now staring at the reports with the cold detachment of coroners. They were witnessing the autopsy of their own doctrine. For 40 years, the Soviet Union had prepared for the Great Clash. They believed that quantity had a quality all its own. They believed that if you poured enough tanks through the Fulda Gap, the West would run out of missiles before the East ran out of armor. The A-10 proved that math was wrong. The statistics were sickening to the Soviet analysts. In just 42 days of combat, the ugly, slow, obsolete Warthogs had destroyed 987 tanks, 501 armored personnel carriers, 1106 artillery pieces, 1,200 trucks. The A-10 fleet had fired over 780,000 rounds of 30mm ammunition. They had launched 4,800 Maverick missiles. And the cost? The Iraqi Air Defense Network, one of the densest in the world, modeled entirely on Soviet principles, had managed to shoot down only 6 A-10s. The exchange rate was not a war. It was an extermination. The Soviet generals realized that their invincible armor was nothing more than a container for the crew. The depleted uranium rounds had not just pierced the tanks, they had pierced the delusion of the Soviet superpower. The era of the massed armored blitzkrieg was over. A single flight of 2 Warthogs could blunt an entire spearhead in 10 minutes. The A-10 didn't just win the physical battle, it won the psychological war through acoustic trauma. The BRRRT sound became a Pavlovian trigger for terror. Because the sound arrives after the impact, surviving soldiers learned that if they heard the noise, they were alive only by luck. The sound wasn't a warning, it was a confirmation that you had been spared. This created a level of battlefield stress that broke units before the first shot was fired. We didn't care about the F-16s, we couldn't see them. But the Warthog, you could see it hunting you. You could hear it breathing. It was personal. The arrogant Titan had mocked the Warthog for being a relic of the past. They didn't understand that it was actually a messenger from the future. It taught the world that high-tech does not always mean fast, sleek, or digital. Sometimes, high-tech is a titanium bathtub and a gun that ignores the laws of probability. The U.S. Air Force had tried to cancel the A-10 before the war. They called it ugly. They wanted fast jets that looked good at air shows. But the Warthog survived its own generals just as it survived the enemy's. It remained in service for another 30 years, a constant, looming shadow over every battlefield from the Balkans to Afghanistan. The final image. The sun sets on the Iraqi desert. A lone A-10 banks slowly over the burning oil fields, its silhouette stark against the orange sky. It is scarred, dirty, and missing paint. It is the ugliest bird in the sky. And to the men on the ground, it is the most beautiful thing they have ever seen. The generals laughed, the engineers calculated, but the Warthog just flew. And in the end, the only thing left in the silence of the chasm was the echo of the gun. They built a wall of steel to stop it. They never realized we would just fly right through it. Subscribe for more stories from the chasm.